and were founded by marketers with marketing and marketeers in mind in 2009. We live and breathe MarTech with the purpose to help you make sense of it and the ever-changing landscape that it sits within. Some of you may be familiar with the MarTech spine concept or philosophy, which is something we created to help marketeers prioritize and simplify the marketing technologies that matter most to their business and ensure that they can be integrated and complement one another for maximum impact and performance. We have a long-standing partnership with Salesforce and the product formerly known as Pardot, having helped Salesforce establish it here in Europe over a decade ago. We now have over 70 Marketing Cloud certifications in the business across the various functions that we have at Clevertouch, including consultancy, tech delivery, data and insights, and of course, the enablement team that Sheff sits within. We also conduct research into MarTech every year in the form of the State of MarTech report, very catchy title, which surveys over 600 senior marketing professionals across the UK, US, and Europe on MarTech adoption, utilization, and overall satisfaction levels, as well as the investment priorities and other trends. It's the only MarTech research conducted in conjunction with an academic research body in the University of Southampton Business School for increased reliability and validity in how the survey is designed and also in the quality of the data that the survey produces. The latest and fifth edition of the research has been released this week. So if you haven't already downloaded it, please do. It's well worth doing so to keep up with what's happening in the market and how your peers and fellow marketeers are using and investing in MarTech. One of the key findings in the research this year is that investment in MarTech services and people are being prioritized more over software licensing for the first time since 2019, which tells us that the acquisition phase that the market has been through over the last 4 or 5 years is finally starting to slow down as marketing leaders and their teams look to better use the platforms that they already have before trying to add something new to their spine. So that's a little bit about us. Sheff, I will hand over to you to talk us through the agenda.
Thank you very much, Rich. And yeah, just to echo that point, I really cannot recommend enough that research. It's meticulously researched and written, and Rich works very hard to get it over the line every year. And it really is very insightful, and this lets you know what the rest of the market are doing at the moment. But for today, we are obviously here to learn about the Engagement Studio. We've used the word Engagement Studio gotchas. Gotchas are just those things that can trip you up. Those things that maybe slip past the notice every now and then. The things that you might think you've got in hand or you almost feel like you've accounted for, and then still they can fall over. So we're going to go over some of those ones that we see all the time. Obviously, we have the distinct pleasure of fixing a lot of these all the time, and we love troubleshooting, but it's great also when it goes right the first time for our clients. So hopefully by the end of today you'll have a bit of a picture of some of those sneaky little things. We are going to do a very, very quick lightning round on the Engagement Studio. I know there's always mixed levels of experience with the Engagement Studio, so I'm going to introduce it a bit, how it works overall. Then we're going to talk about pausing problems. So one of the biggest things with the Engagement Studio, pausing them, it can be a real nightmare. We're also going to talk about timing terrors. So those of you that are building those event sends, you will have time-sensitive sends. There are lots and lots of ways that those cannot go out at the right time. We'll also talk about those troublesome triggers. Anyone that's used those knows there are lots of ways they can fall over, not listening to what they're meant to be or not listening at the right times. And then we're also going to talk about some of the fun things you can see in the reporting. So sometimes those discrepancies are there when we look at reports versus what we're expecting. So we'll look at some of the ways those can happen. And we will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end. But I'm also happy, as Rich says, to take questions as they pop up in the chat if they kind of fit within it. If there's something that I need to take more time on, I'll just move it towards the end of the session where we will have time to wrap up. So the Engagement Studio, for those of you that haven't used it a lot, it is a brilliant tool used to build these long-term engagements with our clients or our customers, however you refer to them. But all the people that we have in our database that we want to engage with, rather than having to manually build emails all the time, let's build these nice adaptable automated journeys with them. We want to change the journey based on who they are, based on how they're engaging with the content, based on things we know about them. We can set them up, we turn them on, and then they just run. And I know some of you who are attending today have brilliant uses of this. And so they are basically made up of 3 parts. Actions are us doing something. So examples of that is going to be sending an email, adding someone to a Salesforce campaign. Typically, they don't cause too many problems. We just go through, something happens, nice and easy. Triggers, they can be a lot more difficult. They're going to be listening for a prospect's engagement, and we're going to split them out based on whether they take the engagement within a certain time frame. Loads of ways that can go wrong. Sounds simple, but when we manage that, it can be very difficult. And then rules are basically splitting people out based on data, based on criteria that we know about them. Again, the fundamentals of how they work, pretty simple. Do they match this rule, yes or no? However, the timing is where we can fall over. My favorite analogy of how the Engagement Studio works is Kerplunk. If you are not familiar, it's a game where you drop lots of marbles into the top here. You've got lots of sticks in the way, and you take turns pulling the sticks out. Depending on which sticks you pull out, the balls will drop through at different times and all end up here at the bottom. That is the way that I have always envisaged the Engagement Studio. If I just jump into an Engagement Studio, we've got our start here at the top, and it drops down. We build our journey in the middle, and it will land here, this red end step here. Therefore, our marbles here are just our prospects, and those sticks that we pull out and put in the way, those are our actions, our triggers, and our rules. And there's a reason I love this analogy that you'll see as we go through. So this is how I always envisage it, and for some reason, that does help some people. Other board games are available for legal reasons. So with our Engagement Studios, one of the biggest issues that we see with Engagement Studios is when people have to pause them. And I'm sure most of you have experienced this at some point. Sometimes it is unavoidable that we need to pause a studio. If we've got a complex nurture that's been running for a few months, we might want to swap out an email. We've got some old content that we need to change out. We might want to do a swap there. We cannot edit an Engagement Studio while it's running. If I was to look at a Engagement Studio that's currently moving along here, here is my Engagement Studio. I've got lots of people moving through it. That's brilliant. Can't be editing things while they're running. So that can cause problems. So we pause them. And that's where it becomes difficult. The pausing simple. We click pause. We make our changes. We click resume. But the difficulty happens is when we resume, there are so many factors in play there. The fundamental element of where things go wrong is that where you pause your Engagement Studio, as soon as you press that pause, every single prospect is held exactly where they currently are. So if I'm looking through one of these studios, let's have a look at this one here. This one's not running. But if I was to look at this one here, as people are moving through, you will see there are different levels of timing. So for example, here, we've got a trigger. This trigger is listening for an email link click, and it's listening for up to 3 days. If I had somebody on day 1 of that trigger and I hit pause, if I then pause this studio and I leave it for a week, 2 weeks, and then I turn the studio back on, they are still on day 1 of that trigger. Okay. Now, obviously, leaving it for 2 weeks is a massive example. But if we're talking pausing it for 2 days, 3 days, just while we sort out the content and put it back on, those people are still being slowed at this point. They will not progress. When you turn it back on, it doesn't recognize that there's been 3 days. Oh, we'll let them move on. It's held them exactly where they are. So this means that you end up with a lot of staggering with people that are trying to move through, because anyone that was meant to progress in a timely fashion hasn't. You can probably picture how that's going to cause issues. If we've got an event that's happening and we've paused because we've got another, let's say we've sent out 2 invites. We actually wanted to add a third to the studio. We pause it. We try and add our 3rd invite. We have to have it paused for a day. We press resume. Everyone is now delayed by a day. So suddenly, if I've got people that are waiting on invites, or even the most common issue that we see when this happens, and the reason that timing can be so important, is that there is a feature in here when we send our emails, and this is very common when we build events, we can send emails on fixed dates. If I send an email on a fixed date, so for example, if I want to send a 1-week reminder before my event happens, I might put a fixed date on it. Let's say my event is next Thursday. I'm going to send my invite out tomorrow, so it's a week ahead. If I had people and I paused and they were sat on a wait step somewhere further up the studio, they are going to arrive a day later than planned here. And if they arrive a day later and they arrive here on Friday, with these fixed date sends, they will skip them entirely. So people can skip chunks of your logic, they can skip email send steps and get caught down elsewhere. So it's just one of those things when you're managing any sort of time sensitive sending, you have to be conscious of how long you're pausing things for. We usually say if you need to pause a studio, you should try and get everything lined up beforehand. If you need to pause a studio, we want it to be paused for the shortest amount of time possible. Wherever possible, when we're pausing studios, we're aiming for less than 20 minutes. Just absolute gold standard. If it's possible, though, less than a day is ideal. And there's some other things to consider in a moment. There is a question that's just popped up in the chat. Yep. A great question, Sarah, because it's later. It's coming up in the slides. So we've also got, when you're pausing, another very big point here. When you pause a studio, this is something that trips loads of people up. Your triggers are not listening during that phase at all. And this is another reason why, if you are pausing a studio that's currently running for an event or that is reading important logic, try not to pause it for very long. If I've sent an email and I'm listening for an email open, if I pause this studio, that trigger stops listening the entire time the studio is paused. Okay. And when I turn the studio back on, if somebody has opened that email during that pause window, they will go down the no path. Even though they opened the email, because they have not done it in that while the studio is running, the trigger wasn't listening at the time it happened, and they will incorrectly be processed down the no path. Again, that breaks the logic, that breaks the entire design that we've had, because we want people to be processed correctly. If they've opened the email, we want them to, in this case, adjust their score by 20. We don't want them to be going down the no path and getting other emails, because that wasn't the journey we designed. So when you're pausing, two things to be very conscious of. When you restart, people are going to be exactly where they were before, including on certain number of days. What you can do, if you've had to pause a studio for longer than a day, you can reduce wait steps. So if I reduced it from 3 days to 2 days, it would recognize that they're now on 1 day of 2. And so they progress to the next day as desired. It's never ideal to be doing that, to be adjusting wait steps during the studio. Always try to have things paused for as short as time possible. And again, triggers will not monitor activity when your studio is paused. So that can always lead to all sorts of incorrect processing. So that's a big one, pausing. There's also things that can fall over all the time when it comes to timing. And I'm always going to go back to this scenario where we're building events. I think building event journeys is the most difficult thing to do in the engagement studio, because when you've got a fixed date, something needs to happen, and you've got people moving through at different speeds, it can be really, really difficult to get a handle on that and get them all back in line. So these are some that I see trip people up all the time. And one of them lines up with Sarah's point. I'm going to start with this first one here, because people do this all the time. If you use a dynamic list to start your engagement studio, the second somebody joins a list, they will immediately enter the studio. Okay, so the kickback of this is, if I've got a dynamic list that's got some slightly broad category, like a slightly broad criteria, for example, their preference for this newsletter is true. The second someone matches the criteria, they join the list. That means they then join the studio. I see this a lot. People use a dynamic list. It does some filtering for them and it gets the audience they want. They've got the correct segmentation, and then they put it into the engagement studio and everyone goes in. The problem is someone joins later on. They go into the studio a week later. And suddenly now I've got my original audience, and now I'm starting to get smatterings of people that are joining that I haven't accounted for that time. And that can lead, again, having people trailing your main invite series by a long way means people are getting invites at the wrong times. They're getting invites that don't make sense. They could receive, a 2-week reminder 3 days before the event if they came in a long way behind. My advice, wherever possible, try not to use a dynamic list to be your entry source if you have any time sensitivity about it. It's fine if you're building like a long-term nurture, But if you are building something that's time sensitive, it is much, much more sensible either to use our old friend segmentation rules. If you're not familiar with segmentation rules, they're a severely underused tool. They live within the prospects tab under segmentation. These run snapshot style automations that will pick people up, put them in your list for you, and then they stop listening. So they run snapshots. So rather than constantly updating the list out of control, you can choose when to run it, and you can rerun the rules to keep injecting people, but it gives you control over the injection timings rather than just being rule-based, very fluid, can happen whenever. Your other solution, thanks to the Summer 23 release, I think it was, we now have the ability to convert our dynamic lists to static. So you can always use your dynamic list to find all your prospects and then convert it to static before you actually start the studio. But this dynamic start list, those people entering at different times, nightmare when you're working with events. Another one, business hours. By this, I mean that sneaky setting that is turned on by default when you make a studio. And it's found in the Start tab. So usually, once people have made their studio the first time, they don't often spend a lot of time revisiting this area. If I click Start here in my studio, I have got a little area here called Business Hours, or send emails during business hours only. This is the Engagement Studio's way of giving you some control over when people receive your emails. The default, or certainly in the instances in this time zone, our default is Monday to Friday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. If somebody arrived at an email send step outside of that window, they would not be sent the email until the next send window started. So if I arrived at a send step at 5 p.m. on a Friday, I don't actually get sent that email until 10 a.m. on a Monday, which means I am now 3 days behind the original planned journey. Again, very, very difficult. When you're working with this, it's very flexible. There's a lot that can go wrong here. You can either extend out your send hours a little bit so that when someone arrives, they're going to get sent straight away. You can turn it off entirely. This slightly opens you up to the chance that someone gets a weird email at like 3 o'clock in the morning. But the way to avoid that is if you turn this off, whenever we talk about a day in Pardot, we're actually talking about 24 hours. So when we say, I know that sounds obvious, but sometimes it's not like a calendar day. It is definitively exactly 24 hours from the time someone arrives. So what you can do to combat this is make sure that everything is spaced nice and evenly apart in a series of days. And then make sure that you start the studio for the first time at a nice point within your window. So start it at that 10 a.m., the start of your send window. Because then if it's got a 15-minute lag to sending out, as Pardot often does with engagement studios, they receive it at 10 a.m. on that time. And then if we give them 3 days, a week, however long our triggers are for, they are then going forwards and it will be at 10 a.m. the next time around. So they will consistently receive emails early in the day. If we turn this on, it's just one of those things. We have to be conscious of it. Don't get caught out, particularly if you've paused the studio. If you pause a studio at 3 o'clock and then you've got the content ready and it goes in at 4:30 and you turn it back on, everybody gets held till 10 a.m. the next day or after the weekend if you do it on a Friday. Really difficult. And people forget about these because they're hidden away. When you're doing these, if you're going to have them on, I think they're great. Just to be clear, I think they're brilliant because it means no one's going to get your business, your webinar invites at 3 a.m. But it does mean that you have to be very conscious of the way you set this up. Because if you are unpausing a studio or starting it for the first time outside of this window, you're going to get an unplanned delay that makes it really difficult. The third one around timing, weekends count towards your wait steps and your triggers. If you, and I think Sarah raised this in the chat, even if you've got business hours on, so even if you have this set on, this only affects when your email send steps actually sends an email. Okay, so I'm Monday to Friday, 10 till 4. That only affects these steps here. What it does not affect is something like a trigger where I'm listening for an email link click, for example. If I put this up to 5 days, that's not affected by the business hours. Now, what that means is if I send this email tomorrow on a Thursday, that will give them Friday, well, give them all of Thursday, all of Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then you're into Monday. So really, if I'm trying to plan, I need to make sure always that I'm applying triggers. If there's a chance they can be over the weekend, I need to possibly think about extending them by a couple of days. You want to factor in the number of business days that you want to give them. Usually the solution to this is to try and use a nice round 7 days. Then it just happens every week. If you can't plan like that and you need to use like 3 days, then again, you're going to have to start thinking about how can I make sure that the first entry point is a fixed point in time. Let's use a segmentation rule. Let's use a static list instead of a dynamic list. Then I've got total control over the entry time. Then I can plan out those days. I know it's going to be 3 days from the Monday to the Thursday for the first email. The second one, I might go out to 5 days so that I'm across to the next Monday. So these timing things, they're very difficult to manage, but just be conscious. Weekends will count, regardless of if you have business hours turned on or not. Those weekend days will count towards those wait steps. Again, I'll always recommend static lists and segmentation rules make way more sense when you've got time-sensitive steps. Triggers. Brilliant, because they let us get hands off. There's no more me having to go into my email template report, seeing who clicked it, making a list of those people, and then sending them a follow-up email. I can use a trigger to monitor the activity. If they click it, they will move down, and I can send them the second email here. Perfect. Saves me loads of time. Problem is, triggers have loads of things that you have to be conscious of. The most obvious one I have already talked about. They will not be monitoring when your studio's paused. Again, if you've got people actively in a journey right now, make sure you're pausing it for a very short amount of time. You don't want those triggers to be deaf for any length of time. Other things I see a lot, triggers are not historic. So if I was to open with a trigger up here that was saying, did this person fill out my form? And I go yes or no. Those people that drop in, they are not going to be assessed based on if they've previously filled out the form. Triggers only listen while the studio is running. This studio has been running for about 3 seconds by the time they land here. Chances of someone filling out a random form in those 3 seconds, pretty low, almost zero. So never start your studios with triggers. Your triggers should always reference something you've directed them to do before. So send them an email asking them to complete the form, then listen for it. Don't just start listening for things at the top. They are not going to review their record and say, have they previously done it? The question that a trigger is asking is, have they done it since I turned the studio on? One I see all the time, people listening for the wrong thing. If you are directing, there's a phrase that will help you here. The landing page is king. If you are a group, if you're a company that is building Pardot forms and hosting them on Pardot landing pages, as most people do, when you listen for that form fill, you are going to listen for a landing page completion. Anyone on here that's done training with me knows that I love this phrase, but the landing page is king. As soon as I put a Pardot form on a Pardot landing page, that landing page now takes credit for everything. So if I want to know, did they fill out my form? I know it sounds daft, but I actually have to go and pick the landing page that the form is hosted on. So here's my webinar registration page, and I'm going to listen for, did they fill out my webinar registration page? Because that's taking the credit. I see it all the time. If you listen for the form and the form's on a Pardot landing page, everyone goes down no, because it doesn't monitor the form as an individual asset. Leaving enough time for tracked engagements to occur. I've kind of covered this in others. Make sure you give people enough time. You know, if I leave this as 0, that is literally going to drop straight through and everyone's going to go down no. If I want to see if someone clicked an email, let me be fair. Let me give them, at least 3, 4 or longer if it's over a weekend. Let's give them enough days to actually perform the engagement. Can't tell you how often I see people giving people 2 days. They send the email on a Friday. Guess what? No one did anything over the weekend. Everyone goes down no. And it makes your studio look like it performed worse than it did because you didn't give people the opportunity to make you look good. And the other thing to be conscious of with triggers is the evaluate up to step. So triggers can work in 2 ways. We can either wait, and I'll do 7 days because it's nice and round. If I wait for 7 days, this is my Kaplunk analogy coming into play. Everyone drops down. We send them the email on the 27th. That stick moves out the way. They get stuck on the 7-day wait. That stick moves out the way. And then we split them, yes or no. Did they click the link in the email? The other one is up to a maximum of 7 days, which a lot of people default to. If I do this, your no path will always be the maximum because you wait up to 7 days, then they get released. But your yes path will release people immediately when they perform the action you've asked for. So in this case, link clicks. If they click that email link, they are straight down the yes path. That in every studio, that therefore means that this branch are now moving at potentially totally different speeds. If someone clicks that day one, they are 7 days ahead of this branch now. And if at any point those people meet back up, you've got to bring them back into line. So just be conscious of that. My usual preference is to keep people on waits because it keeps that studio nice and level. If you do need to accelerate your yes path, use the evaluate function. But unless you have a clear view to speeding people up, wait steps keep it nice and level. And my final page, just conscious of time, our final page here is our perplexing prospects. Even prospects can cause their own issues in these studios. And usually it comes down to data discrepancies and not seeing what you've expected. The big one that catches people out here is opted out prospects. If you have prospects on your start list who have opted out of communications, it is not like when you send a list email. In a list email, they are automatically suppressed from an email send. In engagement studios, they will still enter the studio. They cannot receive emails. They are suppressed from receiving emails, but they still move through the rest of the studio. So I would have people start, opted out people drop in. They can't receive the email. They are therefore always going to go down the no path. I'll send them another email. They're always going to go down the no path because they're not receiving the emails. They're not being given the chance to engage. And the upshot of that realistically is that it makes your audience look less engaged than they were. Right? You as marketers, we want as many people going down this yes path as possible. It makes us look good. We are writing good, engaging content. So let's get the credit for it that we deserve. The easiest thing to do is when you're making your send lists, eliminate people that are opted out. If they've unsubscribed or if they're set to do not email or if they've hard bounced, get rid of them. If you're not having strict control over the start list, so if people are just going to drip feed off of, for example, a form fill that enters people into a studio, what you can do is build a rule right at the start. And it's quite a laborious one to do, but we can use prospect email status and I can build a complex rule. And this is one that I usually use if I don't have control over the start list. We can continually use prospect email status, do not email, and we use prospect email status is opted out, prospect email status is do not email, prospect email status is hard bounce detected, and we can also use soft bounce detected if we wanted to, although that one's slightly less important. We'll build ourselves a complex rule and we're going to change this to any conditions are met. Okay, and so we now have a rule. If somebody is opted out, do not email, hard bounced, or soft bounced, if they're not mailable for any reason, on that yes path, I can hit an end step. That will boot out all those people that are joining that I can't actually send emails to are now out of my studio. They're out of my way. And all those people that I can give the correct experience to, they're now on my yes path and I can build the journey accordingly. Okay. And it's one that I don't think is ever clearly explained anywhere in the interface. Caught me out a few times to start with. You're seeing lots of people go down the no path more than we'd expect. Usually it's because opted out prospects are moving through. They're not receiving the emails. They're littering that no path. The other thing we see, and I promise this is the last point, in our reports tab, when you see your reports, the number that you see above any of these nodes, so above the blue points here, that is always the number of people who have completed that step. Okay. So what we sometimes see, if I've got a wait step on one of my actions, so I've got wait 7 days before I actually do that, you will see people move through here. And what you can see is something like 50% and then 0. If you were to look at the report in that 7 days, you would see 0 because the number is people who have completed that step. It does not factor in all the people that are currently waiting to go through it. So they just haven't been seen yet. So you might see lots of data. It's all hit that trigger. We've seen all those people be sorted and then there's 0. What on earth is going on? It's usually because they're stuck on the wait step for that step. Once they complete it, that's when the number goes up. And that's when you can see it reflected. again, hear it all the time. We get people panicking. Oh, I can see all these people went down. Yes, where have they gone? They're just waiting. You won't see them until they finish the step. Cool. Whistle stop tour. So,
Chef, quick question from me would be, if there was one thing for people to take away, what would it be? What's your biggest gotcha of what you've covered?
Ooh, that's a great question. It's definitely the dynamic lists when they start studios, because dynamic lists are great. They're so convenient. We all use them because I don't want to go through my database of 300,000 people and find all the people who are from the finance industry. It's going to take me ages. I don't want to export it into CSV and do it. So I use my dynamic list. But the problem is, if someone new joins a database from finance and I'm using that to start a studio, they go straight through and I've lost control of the start times. And when that happens with time-sensitive sends, it's disastrous. Your journey falls to bits. So I would say always we want to keep that strict control over when you enter.
Okay.
And laying out templates can really help this. Like, people that struggle with these issues, usually we find that if someone has a template for a nurture, and this is one, if you're not using templated nurtures yourselves just yet, it's definitely one to consider. They build template nurtures that address the common gotchas that they experience as a business. They just have to clone them each time and drop their content in, and it makes life a lot easier.
And how can people go about? Is there such a thing as like a shop window of templates, or is it something that people have to create from scratch?
They're usually best done from people that know your business. There are probably advice and cookie cutter stuff out there, but the fact of the matter is you don't know what your common problems are until you've started to build these journeys. So I'd usually say either try and build them yourselves. Let's agree what our format will be. We're going to send out our first email invite before an event 2 weeks before, then we send a 1 week, then we send a 1 day. If we stick to a structured format, we can build a template nurture, and every time we just copy, we change the emails. Yeah. That's how you can get control over these things. You find something that works and you do it every time.
Yeah.
And I know that's not always easy. And if you do get stuck, not sales pitching, but if you get stuck, that's what we do.
Yeah. Good stuff. So in the past, you've run some one-to-one training sessions or group training on template build and deployment.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. So something we love to do. So the engagement studio, it's one great big minefield, to be honest with you. So if there is anyone who sat through this and gone, don't even understand some of the things you're talking about, or you kind of can't quite see what the easy solution is, we do offer training for entire teams or for individuals. We'll run short workshops specifically on the engagement studio. We can get out all your questions that perhaps you didn't ask today.
Good stuff. And that's a nice way to round up and just check if anyone has any questions. I don't think I've seen anything else come in other than Sarah's question from earlier in the session. Thanks, Sarah. So if there are no more questions, just to say thanks for joining, everyone. We will send the recording of the session to you all. And if you have any questions on the content that Paul has covered, or any other questions on any help or guidance you might need on Engagement Studio, then please do feel free to reach out to us, training@clever-touch.com. Okie doke. Well, thanks again, Chef, for covering today's content. Our next Pardot webinar is never that far away, so we will be in touch with you all on the content for the next one. And just to say again, the State of MarTech research is now out there, and perhaps we'll include a link to that as part of the follow-up from today as well. So thanks, everyone, and we hope to see you on the next one.
Thanks, everyone.